Charlie Kirk's voice cracked, not with reason, but with rage. His words tumbled over one another, sharp, frantic, desperate to reclaim control of a room already slipping from his grasp. His fists pressed into the table as if force could steady him. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't break her composure. Instead, with deliberate calm, she slid a stack of papers forward, receipts, records, line after line that spelled out more than talking points ever could. The room seemed to inhale. Every camera tightened its focus. Every microphone leaned in closer. Kirk sputtered, his familiar bravado punctured by the weight of the evidence now resting between them. Crockett's eyes didn't gloat. They measured. Her silence spoke louder than his thunder. And then, just as Kirk's face reddened with fury, the image seemed to freeze in time. The echo of his broken voice lingered, suspended in the air. Viewers watching live gripped their phones, their remotes, their keyboards. Some whispered to each other in disbelief. Others shouted at their screens, already sensing history unfolding. The question wasn't whether this was another heated exchange, it was something far larger. For in that single moment, arrogance met accountability. The invincible aura of wealth and influence collided head-on with the steady hand of truth. And the nation, whether by television, live stream, or the endless scroll of social feeds, could not look away. How did we get here? How did one congresswoman, armed not with billions but with unshakable resolve, push the leader of Turning Point USA into a corner he couldn't shout his way out of? The answer isn't found in this frozen instant alone. It lives in the steps that brought both of them to this table, in the years of bluster and billions that shielded Kirk from scrutiny, and in the lived battles that sharpened Crockett's spine into steel. Because this was not a chance encounter. This was a collision waiting to happen. And as the cameras rolled and the country held its breath, one thing became undeniable. Charlie Kirk was no longer steering the conversation. Jasmine Crockett was. To understand why Charlie Kirk lost his composure, we need to rewind to the very moment this battle began. Turning Point USA was never just another nonprofit on the political landscape. From its earliest days, it was engineered to be a cultural weapon, an institution dressed in the language of youth activism, but fueled by the deep pockets of billionaire donors who preferred to work in the shadows. Behind its glossy conferences, free merchandise, and carefully staged rallies lay a machine designed to mold loyalty, spread ideology, and most importantly, control the flow of money and influence in ways the average voter could hardly trace. Its leader, Charlie Kirk, styled himself as a rebel with a microphone, railing against the establishment. But what many Americans didn't see, what wasn't splashed across their Instagram feeds, was the sheer scale of the empire quietly growing under his watch. Millions in undisclosed donations, cozy relationships with mega-donors whose names only surfaced in leaked documents or obscure filings, lavish spending cloaked in the language of grassroots. For years, these finances had remained buried behind layers of spin, opaque to the very public they claimed to represent. And this was where Jasmine Crockett entered the picture. A congresswoman from Texas, she hadn't risen to power by courting billionaires. She wasn't the beneficiary of corporate pipelines. Her story was different, built on the courtroom floor, forged in the fires of activism, rooted in communities who had lived the consequences of corruption rather than profited from it. When she raised her voice about accountability, it wasn't theory. It was lived truth. That contrast, one man backed by hidden millions, the other woman backed by nothing but conviction, was what electrified the confrontation. For Crockett, this wasn't just about a line item on a balance sheet. It was about the very principle of whether America's democracy could still belong to its people, or whether it had already been sold to the highest bidder. Viewers could sense it. The stakes weren't abstract. Every dollar funneled unchecked into Turning Point meant another voice drowned out, another election tilted, another policy shaped in the dark. Crockett knew this, and she knew her presence at that table carried the weight of millions who would never be invited into those rooms. Her calm wasn't detachment. It was the discipline of someone who understood exactly how rare this moment was, and how desperately the truth needed to break through. The cameras magnified that dynamic. Social feeds buzzed as screenshots spread. Kirk, flushed with frustration. Crockett, resolute with documents in hand. Hashtags like the "follow the money" and receipts started climbing. People who had never tuned in to political hearings before were now glued to their screens, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding, a historic takedown in real time. It was more than entertainment. It was validation. For countless Americans, especially immigrants, working families, and those who had felt powerless in the face of billion-dollar influence, Crockett's calm defiance was a mirror of their own struggles. If she could hold her ground against a machine like Turning Point, perhaps they, too, could believe corruption wasn't invincible. But as the room tilted in her favor and the audience rallied behind her, one fact remained. Charlie Kirk wasn't used to losing ground, and if his donors expected anything from him, it was dominance. The moment Crockett dared to challenge his empire, she crossed a line he was determined to defend at all costs. But Kirk wasn't about to let this challenge go unanswered. Charlie Kirk's story has always been told as if it were a rags-to-riches tale. The young man who defied convention and built a movement from scratch. He branded himself as the college dropout who saw through the liberal stranglehold on campuses and had the courage to fight back. To his followers, he was a symbol of raw ambition, someone who could rally thousands with little more than a microphone, a slogan, and a promise to take back America's future. But peel back the mythology and the image begins to crumble. Kirk wasn't simply a lone fighter clawing his way up from obscurity. From his earliest days, his rise was greased by the deep pockets of wealthy patrons eager to shape the next generation in their image. Billionaire benefactors wrote the checks, provided the stages, and elevated his voice long before he had earned the credibility. His charisma mattered, yes, but without the steady drip of donor dollars, the Turning Point empire would never have grown into the sprawling machine it became. By his early 20s, Kirk had already positioned himself as the voice of youthful conservatism, appearing on national television, rubbing shoulders with political elites, and basking in the glow of influence. Yet behind every rally, every flashy event, every social media blitz, lay the shadow of untraceable money. Turning Point, USA was structured not just as a nonprofit, but as a labyrinth of interconnected organizations' shells that allowed funds to flow in and out without the transparency most charities are required to provide. Millions could vanish into program expenses with no clear explanation. Lavish perks could be justified as outreach. And through it all, Kirk smiled for the cameras, insisting that his work was powered by nothing more than grassroots passion. This was the contradiction that defined him. On stage, he railed against elites and corruption, presenting himself as the champion of the everyday student. Yet offstage, his benefactors were the very elites he claimed to despise: hedge fund titans, real estate moguls, and political power brokers who had little in common with the young crowds waving Turning Point banners. He denounced government waste while presiding over an organization notorious for opaque accounting. He preached self-reliance while depending on donors to bankroll his every move. And Kirk reveled in it. His arrogance wasn't hidden, it was part of his brand. He strutted across stages with the certainty of someone untouchable, someone who believed the combination of wealth and charisma placed him above scrutiny. Critics were dismissed as jealous, irrelevant, or anti-American. Students who dared to question Turning Point's finances were mocked or silenced. He thrived in the echo chamber of applause, intoxicated by the belief that dominance equaled truth. For years, this strategy worked. In conservative circles, Kirk became untouchable, a golden boy who could deliver fiery soundbites and rally youth support without ever facing serious accountability. Journalists who tried to follow the money found themselves stonewalled by evasive filings and a wall of spin. And in political hearings, his allies made sure the spotlight rarely turned his way. But power has a way of breeding complacency. The empire Kirk built had grown so vast, so bloated, that cracks began to show. Lavish conferences drew scrutiny for their extravagance. Donations poured in without clear explanations of where they were going. And whispers circulated that the grassroots movement was little more than a brand, a pipeline for money and influence masquerading as activism. It was in this atmosphere of unchecked arrogance that Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the stage. Unlike journalists, she couldn't be stonewalled. Unlike intimidated students, she couldn't be silenced. Her questions came with legal teeth and public visibility. Kirk, so accustomed to controlling the narrative, now faced someone who wasn't impressed by his swagger, someone who understood that the numbers on a page could speak louder than his endless bravado. And this is where the drama sharpened, because for all his wealth, all his influence, all his carefully crafted image, Charlie Kirk had never truly faced a challenger who could look him in the eye without blinking. He had never been forced to defend the financial skeletons buried in Turning Point's closets, never been cornered by someone who knew exactly how to follow the money. His empire had been built on the assumption that no one would dare, that his power was shield enough, that his opponents would be too afraid or too unprepared to confront him. But what Kirk didn't count on was a congresswoman who had nothing to lose and everything to expose. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin under the blinding lights of a televised clash. It begins in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where dignity was tested daily, and where the fight for fairness wasn't theoretical, it was survival. Growing up, she saw firsthand how systems tilted against ordinary people, how families could lose everything not because they lacked ambition, but because the rules were written to keep them out. Those early lessons planted in her a seed that would grow into a career defined by confrontation with power. Before Congress, before the cameras, Crockett walked the halls of courthouses as a defense attorney. Her clients weren't executives or political operatives. They were the overlooked, working-class families crushed by fines, young people targeted by over-policing, immigrants navigating a system designed to confuse and punish. She carried their stories into every argument, every cross-examination, every closing statement. Each case was more than a paycheck. It was a chance to stand as a shield for people who had none. It was in those courtrooms that she honed her sharpest weapon precision. She learned to cut through the noise, to see through bluster, to find the one contradiction that unraveled an entire case. She also learned composure, how to keep her voice steady when prosecutors yelled, how to hold her ground when judges tried to rush her, how to make silence itself into a form of power. These skills, tested under pressure, became the hallmarks of her public persona. Activism sharpened the other edge of her identity. Crockett didn't just fight inside the courtroom, she marched outside it. She was visible in protests, unflinching in interviews, fearless in calling out inequities that others softened with euphemism. Her name began to circulate among communities hungry for leaders who would not compromise when justice was at stake. She became known not just for what she fought against, but for the clarity with which she articulated what she stood for: dignity, accountability, and the belief that America's promises should belong to everyone, not just the wealthy few. By the time she entered Congress, she was already armed with a reputation that made opponents uneasy. On the House floor and in committee hearings, her sharp comebacks became legend. She had a knack for exposing hypocrisy with a single line, for reducing arrogance to stammering silence without ever raising her volume. Clips of her rebuttals spread online, shared by people who saw in her the voice they wished they had in their own workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods. To her supporters, she was more than a representative. She was a living rebuttal to the idea that money and privilege always win. What set Crockett apart was her refusal to perform weakness. In a political arena where women, especially women of color, are so often expected to apologize for their presence, she refused to dim her fire. She walked into every chamber as if she belonged there because she did. And in doing so, she created space for others to imagine themselves belonging too. Her path was never cushioned by billionaires or padded by lobbyists. Every step carried the weight of people who had placed their faith in her, people who had lived too long under leaders who ignored them. That trust gave her armor, and it also gave her clarity. When she confronted corruption, she wasn't just debating policy. She was carrying the lived experiences of countless families whose voices were too often drowned out. And so, when Jasmine Crockett found herself seated across from Charlie Kirk, she wasn't stepping into foreign territory. She was stepping into yet another version of the courtroom battles she had fought her entire life. A loud, arrogant opponent confident that bluster could overshadow truth. She had seen this posture before in prosecutors who overstated their case, in officials who insisted on their authority, in wealthy adversaries who assumed their resources made them untouchable. Each time she had answered with the same steady defiance. What viewers saw that day wasn't improvisation. It was the culmination of years of preparation, sharpened by lived struggle, fueled by the certainty that the truth was her greatest ally. While Kirk relied on money and influence, Crockett relied on something far more durable: the discipline to remain calm while the powerful unraveled before her. Her journey had made her the perfect foil for Kirk's empire. Where he projected arrogance, she radiated composure. Where he cloaked himself in wealth, she wrapped herself in the armor of justice. And where he assumed fear would silence her, she carried the resilience of communities that had never had the luxury of silence. It was a clash written by destiny. On one side, an overconfident Goliath backed by invisible millions. On the other, a congresswoman forged in the fire of real battles, armed not with wealth but with truth. And when their worlds collided under the bright studio lights, it was only a matter of time before sparks turned to wildfire. The moment the cameras went live, Charlie Kirk leaned forward, eager to seize the spotlight before anyone else could. His voice came fast, sharp, a cascade of talking points meant to overwhelm. He waved his hands, invoked patriotism, framed himself as the victim of a witch hunt. The goal was clear: dominate the stage with sheer volume. He'd done it countless times before, and it had always worked, but this time, across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not bite. She didn't interrupt, didn't mirror his volume, didn't even glance at his hands slicing the air. She sat still, her posture unshaken, eyes steady as if she were watching a storm rage from behind bulletproof glass. That composure alone rattled Kirk, who was used to opponents rising to his bait. As he rattled off statistics and slogans, she waited. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with anger. It was with surgical calm. "You mentioned transparency, Charlie. Let's start there. Can you explain why Turning Point shifted millions into program expenses without detailing where they went?" The room shifted. Gasps rippled from the live audience. The moderators blinked, unprepared for the bluntness. Kirk stuttered for half a beat before regaining his bark. He dismissed her question as left-wing nonsense, accused her of parroting talking points, accused her of attacking young conservatives who were just trying to learn. The volume rose, but the cracks showed. Crockett didn't raise her tone. She leaned slightly forward, her voice measured. "It's a simple question. Where did the money go?" On social media, clips began to circulate in real time. Hashtags like receipts and follow the money started trending, as viewers posted side-by-side screenshots of Crockett's calm interrogation and Kirk's sputtering evasions. Some tweets carried still frames of Kirk's reddened face, captioned, "This is what panic looks like." Others clipped Crockett's steady delivery, celebrating her as the embodiment of dignity under fire. Back on stage, Kirk tried to pivot. He launched into anecdotes about saving campuses from liberal indoctrination. But each diversion only emphasized the gap between his rhetoric and her precision. The more he dodged, the clearer it became that he had no clean answer. Crockett let the silence after her questions hang, a tactic honed from her courtroom days. In that silence, Kirk's defensiveness grew louder than her words. The tension was no longer abstract. It was visible. Audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some murmured. Others craned their necks to catch the reaction of the moderators, who were scrambling to maintain control of a conversation slipping beyond their grip. The spectacle had stopped being a debate. It was becoming a cross-examination, and Crockett knew it. Each time Kirk tried to bluster his way back into dominance, she responded with another precise jab. "If it's all above board, why the layers of shell organizations?" Pause. "If you're so proud of these donors, why not disclose them?" Another pause. Each question landed like a hammer, exposing the hollow core beneath his performance. The rhythm of the exchange began to flip. Where Kirk had opened with confidence, now he fumbled, his sentences running over themselves, his volume betraying his unease. Where Crockett had started in silence, Now she guided the tempo, every word measured, every pause strategic. The audience could feel it. The ground was shifting. And as Twitter feeds lit up with split-screen memes, Kirk sweating, Crockett, serene, the clash transformed into something larger than the two figures on stage. It became a parable about truth versus bluster, dignity versus arrogance, accountability versus avoidance. Viewers didn't just watch. They chose sides, and their reactions amplified the drama far beyond the studio. Kirk's allies in the crowd tried to clap louder, to drown out the discomfort. But even their applause couldn't mask the unease settling in the room. Each time Crockett returned to the documents in front of her, each time she let silence fill the air, the audience leaned closer, waiting for the next reveal. The escalation was complete. The storm Kirk had unleashed was no longer under his control. Crockett, calm as ever, had steered it back toward him, and everyone watching could sense the inevitability of what was coming next. Then, with one sentence, she flipped the entire room upside down. The studio fell quiet, the kind of quiet that hums with expectation. For a moment, all that could be heard was the faint shuffle of papers as Jasmine Crockett slid a crisp, stapled packet across the table. Her hands didn't shake, her voice didn't waver. She simply said, "Charlie, these are your own filings." Kirk's jaw clenched, the camera catching the flicker of tension in his face. He tried to smirk, tried to play it off, but the smirk broke halfway, bending into something tighter, less controlled. Crockett lifted the first page. "Here," she said, tapping the top line. "You reported $5.7 million in program expenses, but the breakdown? Missing. The supporting receipts? Absent. You've been asked before, and every time you deflect." She paused, letting the silence fill the space like a drumbeat. "So I'll ask again, where did the money go?" The crowd stirred. A low murmur swept the room. Kirk reached for his microphone, firing back, "This is the typical smear campaign. You people don't understand how nonprofits operate. We're empowering students across the country." But Crockett didn't flinch. She turned another page. "Empowering students? Interesting choice of words. Because on this very line, Turning Point reported over $800,000 in travel expenses. That's nearly $1 million. For students? Or for you?" The gasp was audible. Some in the audience covered their mouths. Others whispered, their eyes darting to the moderators who sat frozen, unprepared for this avalanche. Kirk's face reddened. He tried to laugh, but it came out strained, brittle. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snapped. His hand chopped through the air, desperate to cut her down. "We send students to conferences, Crockett cut him off, her tone steady as steel. "I have the receipts, Mr. Kirk, literally, charter flights, 5-star hotels, lavish dinners billed as outreach." She held up a document, the numbers highlighted for emphasis. The cameras zoomed in, broadcasting the evidence to millions of screens. If this is grassroots, then the grass is made of gold. The room erupted gasps, nervous laughter, scattered applause that quickly swelled. Twitter lit up in real time. Screenshots of Crockett holding the documents. Captions like, "She brought the receipts." Literally, just receipts. Memes flooded the feed within minutes. Kirk's clenched jaw plastered side by side with Crockett's calm stare. Kirk slammed back, "This is ridiculous. You're twisting the facts. You Democrats always attack success because you can't build anything yourselves." His voice cracked under the weight of his own fury. But Crockett leaned in, her words soft, deliberate, impossible to ignore. "This isn't about Democrats or Republicans. This is about honesty. You talk about accountability while your organization hides behind shadow donors and shell accounts. You claim to speak for young people, but you live like a king on their backs. So tell us, why should anyone trust you?" For a moment, silence swallowed the stage. Kirk opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes darted to the moderators, to the cameras, as if someone else might rescue him. No one did. Slow-motion replay would later capture this instant. The beads of sweat at his temple, the tightening of his fists, the falter in his breath. It was the unraveling of a man who had built his career on never being challenged, suddenly confronted with the one opponent he couldn't bulldoze. The audience erupted again, this time with applause that rolled like thunder. Hashtags spiked, Kirk exposed, follow the money, Mick drop Crockett. Commentators began drafting takes before the segment even ended. Crockett pressed further, her tone never shifting from calm precision. In your own words, you say Turning Point is about transparency. Yet when the numbers don't add up, you call it a smear. When the questions get hard, you hide behind slogans. Which is it, Mr. Kirk? Are you transparent or are you terrified? The shot lingered on Kirk's face, red, tight, his eyes flashing with fury he could no longer control. He tried to interject, cutting her off mid-sentence, but his interruptions only made the contrast sharper. Every time he barked, she waited, then resumed with unshaken clarity. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The moderators, sensing the magnitude, leaned back and let it unfold. They knew a viral moment was writing itself, live. Then came the line that sealed it. Crockett lowered the papers, folded her hands, and said evenly, "If you have nothing to hide, then answer. If you can't, the American people can draw their own conclusions." The crowd exploded. Cheers, whistles, even a few standing ovations from the back rows. The sound swallowed Kirk's attempted rebuttal, his voice drowned by the roar of vindication. Social media split-screened the moment within seconds. On one side, Crockett calm and composed. On the other, Kirk flailing, his face a storm of rage and denial. "This is the exact second he lost," one caption read. Another simply declared, "Receipts over rhetoric." And yet, for all the triumph filling that studio, there was a sense that this was only the beginning. Crockett hadn't just dismantled Kirk. She had cracked open the door to a much larger story, one that millions were now desperate to follow. Because the takedown wasn't confined to those walls. The ripple effects were already beginning to spread outward through social media, through political commentary, through the very donors Kirk had once counted on to shield him. But the shockwaves didn't stop at that table. The second the segment ended, the internet ignited. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett sliding those receipts across the table dominated every major platform. On Twitter, the hashtag #receipts shot to the #1 spot nationally, joined quickly by Mick drop Crockett and Kirk exposed. Screenshots of Kirk's reddened face and clenched jaw went viral, overlaid with captions like, "When the truth finally hits," and "This is what panic looks like." TikTok users cut the exchange into looping sound bites, layering Crockett's calm delivery over dramatic music. Teenagers who had never watched a political debate before were suddenly quoting her lines in hallways and classrooms. On Instagram, Reels stitched Crockett's words with applause tracks, morphing her into a pop culture heroine overnight. But it didn't stop with memes. Political commentators rushed to publish takes, framing the confrontation as a turning point. One conservative-leaning outlet reluctantly admitted, "Kirk was caught off guard in a way we've never seen." Progressive platforms celebrated it as proof that arrogance collapses under the weight of receipts. Even mainstream journalists, often hesitant to amplify moments from debates, couldn't ignore the sheer virality of the clip. Late-night hosts seized on the spectacle, devoting entire monologues to Kirk's unraveling. One compared his stammering to a kid who didn't study for the test but still tried to argue with the teacher. Another joked that Crockett deserved an Emmy for Best Performance in a live political smackdown. The laughter amplified what millions already sensed, that this wasn't just a debate. It was humiliation made public, and Crockett had orchestrated it with precision. Celebrities chimed in too. Musicians, actors, even athletes reposted the clip, some praising Crockett directly, others mocking Kirk's meltdown. A Grammy-winning artist tweeted, "We need leaders like this everywhere. Calm, sharp, unbothered. Cite receipts." The ripple effect was undeniable. Crockett wasn't just trending in political circles. She was crossing into pop culture, becoming a symbol of poise under pressure. For ordinary viewers, the moment carried something deeper. It wasn't just entertainment. It was validation. People who had long felt drowned out by the sheer volume of money and politics saw themselves reflected in Crockett's quiet persistence. They flooded comment sections with gratitude. She's speaking for us. Finally, someone standing up to the machine. This is what courage looks like. The collective energy built into a wave. Organizers clipped the exchange for rallies. Activists used it to recruit new supporters, and educators even played it in classrooms as an example of composure against chaos. What had begun as a heated debate became a cultural artifact, proof that truth could puncture arrogance in real time. For Kirk, the fallout was brutal. His allies scrambled to defend him, but their statements sounded hollow against the raw footage already etched into the public imagination. Every denial only invited more mockery. Every excuse became another meme. Donors, usually invisible, now found themselves trending as online sleuths connected names to the money trails Crockett had unveiled. The aura of invincibility that Kirk had cultivated for years cracked wide open. And still, the conversation wasn't just about him. Crockett's performance inspired a broader narrative. That accountability, often dismissed as boring or procedural, could be electrifying when delivered with precision. It wasn't just her words that resonated, it was the way she held her ground, embodying dignity in the face of fury. She didn't shout, she didn't flail. She let the truth speak, and that restraint carried a power no volume could match. On campuses, in workplaces, in family group chats, people retold the moment like folklore. Did you see when she said that? Did you catch his face after? The story became a shared cultural touchstone, binding strangers through a collective experience of vindication. It was no longer just Crockett's moment. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt silenced by power, everyone who had longed to see arrogance humbled. The FOMO was real. Those who missed the live exchange scrambled to catch up, clicking links, watching replays, sharing clips with captions like, "If you haven't seen this yet, you need to." It wasn't just about being informed. It was about belonging to a movement, a chorus of millions echoing the same reaction. At last, accountability had a face, and while the hashtags burned bright and the laughter echoed across late-night stages, something quieter lingered beneath the spectacle. A question that outlasted the memes, a truth that no trending topic could fully contain. Yet beyond the hashtags and headlines, the confrontation left a deeper question. When the noise of the viral frenzy began to fade, what remained was not just a clash of personalities, but a reminder of what dignity looks like when it's put to the test. Jasmine Crockett had not simply out-argued Charlie Kirk. She had modeled something far rarer. The strength to hold her ground without losing her composure, the courage to speak truth without shouting, the conviction to treat accountability as a shield rather than a weapon. In that sense, the confrontation was never only about Turning Point's finances. It was about the larger story of what happens when arrogance collides with integrity. For years, Kirk had thrived on bluster, relying on volume and confidence to drown out doubt. But as millions saw that night, arrogance can crumble in seconds when faced with someone who does not bend, who does not bite, who simply insists on the truth. Crockett's lesson extended beyond the stage. She reminded the country that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, unflinching. Sometimes it's the refusal to match rage with rage, the decision to let facts do the speaking. In that stillness lies a deeper kind of strength, one that resonates far beyond the immediate clash. And for countless viewers, the moral was personal. Immigrants saw in Crockett a defender who honored their struggles, a reminder that their stories mattered even when drowned out by money and megaphones. Working families saw someone who embodied the resilience they live every day, proof that dignity can stand tall against wealth. Young people saw that politics didn't have to be about sound bites or cynicism. It could still be about character. What gave the moment its power was not only Crockett's mastery of the facts but also her refusal to forget the human stakes behind them. When she asked where the money went, she wasn't just asking about numbers on a page. She was asking whether democracy itself was being bought out from under the people it was meant to serve. Her questions carried the weight of those who rarely have a seat at the table, those who cannot hire lobbyists or fund PACs, but who still believe in the promise of fairness. Kirk may have lost his composure, But Crockett offered something far more important: composure as resistance. She showed that restraint can be revolutionary, that dignity itself can be a form of defiance. And in doing so, she redefined what victory looks like in an age where politics often rewards noise over substance. The moral could not be clearer. Money can buy microphones, but it cannot purchase credibility. Power can shape narratives, but it cannot erase receipts. And arrogance may win the room for a season, but when the truth finally arrives, it levels the field in an instant. In the days that followed, as commentators and celebrities dissected the clash, one theme kept resurfacing. Crockett had reminded people that the fight for accountability is not abstract. It is urgent. It is tangible. It belongs to everyone who refuses to be silenced. Her calm rebuttals became more than viral clips. They became lessons in courage for classrooms, offices, kitchens, and community centers. Because the real victory wasn't just that Kirk was exposed. The real victory was that millions of Americans felt, for a fleeting moment, that integrity still had a place in public life. That even in an era of billionaires and misinformation, the truth could still cut through. And that when dignity is placed at the center of a battle, it does more than win, it inspires. Because when dignity speaks louder than money, the world doesn't just watch, it remembers. Charlie Kirk may have entered that room believing he could dominate through volume, but what unfolded told a different story. Jasmine Crockett, armed with nothing more than patience, precision, and receipts, turned his empire of bluster into rubble before a live audience. The moment captured in the title "Kirk Losing It," as Crockett exposed the truth, wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a declaration that arrogance will always fall before integrity. For millions watching, it was vindication. The cameras may have focused on two figures, but the meaning reached far wider. This wasn't about one congresswoman versus one media figure. It was about the enduring struggle between corruption and accountability, between wealth and truth, between those who shout and those who stand tall in silence. And this time, dignity won. That victory belongs to you too. Every viewer who shared the clip, every comment that amplified her courage, every person who saw themselves reflected in her composure together, you turned a moment into a movement. You proved that when the people demand transparency, even the loudest voices can be humbled. But this is only the beginning. If you believe in leaders who fight with receipts instead of rhetoric, if you believe in courage that rises above corruption, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and help spread the message that truth still matters, that dignity still resonates, and that accountability is still possible. Because this isn't just Jasmine Crockett's fight. It's our fight. And when we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced, we remind the world of a truth that no amount of money can erase. Integrity triumphs over corruption always.